about 4 hours going. Does that count?
Yeah, so this is a modification of my DeepSec talk that I did in Vienna last year. So no, you didn't get fresh content, but on the other hand, they paid for me to fly out and stuff, so it's expensive. Because a lot of the content's really good, from explaining if you're dealing with customers, if you're dealing with a business, if you're in a big bank like ours, why things are so goofed up. So this is a little about me and my past. Sales engineer backgrounds, product management. This is back when everybody had a static packet filter for their Cisco 2600. My first job was now upsell them on this $50,000 gauntlet thing, 1995, 96. Have been a security product manager a couple times on and off. Did some e-commerce work back when that was a thing to do in 2000. Risk consultant. I worked on the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, if you're familiar with that document. I work with IONS, and so I walk around the room talking to people all over the country where they talk about their difficulties and their problems, and we kind of have this. IONS, if you don't know, is like a therapy session for security professionals. And you get 40 people in a room, you give them a topic, and they all go, I suck at this, why? And then everybody says, yeah, we suck too. So like vendor management, like how do you know your vendors are really protecting your stuff? That's a terrible conversation because nobody can know. Everybody's like, well, we make them fill out a 300 question spreadsheet. And you're like, yeah, but you know that doesn't protect you. I'm like, yeah, but we have a spreadsheet. You know, that's how those things go.
You feel warm and fuzzy?
Yeah, you do. Well, when the auditors and regulators come in, you say, and here's my collection of spreadsheets. We're obviously safe and doing a great job. And I currently work for a systemically important financial institution that happens to be headquartered here. Here I do assurance and GRC. Used to do security engineering and ops, but we decided they were better off in network engineering, which I found out today might not have been a great choice.
Just today.
Yeah. So this is William Thompson, first Baron Kelvin and measurement badass. When you can measure what you're speaking about and express in numbers, you know something about it. He's often quoted about, you know, about measurement and about scientific method and all that stuff. And is kind of an inspiration, and part of this is comes from me having great conversations with people who think about InfoSec and think about, well, how do you do the science thing? Anybody see Mudge is now going to do UL Labs?
Yeah.
That a lot of us have wanted to do for a long time. 2 years ago at RSA, I was sitting on a panel with a bunch of people, and we were talking about that exact same thing. I think it should be more of a half a center of disease control and half a UL Labs, right? Because the CDC is going to say, all right, that would be a way for the NSA to feel good about spying on everybody, because they could say, well, we're not going to give you the particulars, but there's an outbreak over here. And here's what the outbreak looks like, and here's how, you know, you might want to get out and protect yourself in critical infrastructure. So that was my spin on that one. Why Sopel wanted to call it a he saw the National Transportation Safety Board thing where, you know, if you have any sort of aircraft incident, whether you landed somewhere and the windsock was damaged or you crashed jetliners, you have to fill out this report, and there has to be discussions about what goes on, and you have to go into it and understand that. Obviously, I'm sympathetic to that because of my work with the Data Breach Investigations Report. More on that later. So where we are as an industry, and this is Dan Gear quote that I love, him oversimplifying a very terribly complex topic as he's prone to do. Security is now so essential a concern we can no longer use adjectives and adverbs, but must instead use numbers. Right? Unfortunately, if science is based on inductive observations, it's based on measurement. Again, measurement badass Lord Kelvin here. Where are we in the family of sciences? The answer's not cool. We're like the crazy uncle who kind of sometimes forgets to wear pants, right? So it's really bad. If you think I'm crazy, take, for example, CVSS. And I'll mention Steve Christine has seen this. He knows it. He laughs out loud at this. But here it goes. This is from CVSS and the documentation explaining how it works, or maybe the last version. Forgive me if it's not up to date. But the base equation multiplies impact by 0.6 and exploitability by 0.4. That's a base equation that's supposed to give you knowledge about how it happens. This is insane. This is like saying jet engine times peanut butter equals shiny, right? Because you're talking with impact of 0.6 and exploitability of 0.4. These are ordinal values. You didn't actually measure. You just said, this feels like 0.6 because it's not exactly a 0.7, I guess, but I have no measurement on that. It's kind of like saying, I like the Cardinals better than the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team better than Dallas Cowboys football team because I like them, right? It has no basis in actual measurement. The other cool thing about this is this, 0.6 and 0.4. Just because you've put a decimal in there, it makes you feel good about I've done math, but it's absolute nonsense. And you can tell it's nonsense because if you move the decimal point around and it doesn't materially impact the magnitude of the outcome, it's goofy. So in this case, it doesn't matter if the outcome is 0.24 or 240 million, right? If you made that a 0.7, it wouldn't really matter as well. You see what I'm saying? So decimals aren't magic. Just because you're adding them doesn't automatically make it math. It just means you feel better about the math. And this is what Dan says what Dan means when he says we have an ordinal scale at best, not an interval scale, and certainly not a ratio scale. And if you're familiar with scales and measurement and science, these things kind of pop out at you, saying, "Oh yeah, that makes sense, right?" So this is philosophy of science badass Thomas Kuhn, and Thomas Kuhn's famous for saying, "Here's how things go from kind of dogma and weirdness and so forth to actual science. You start off in this dogma stage. People start really giving it some critical thought. You get to a proto-science stage. Then you get to a normal science stage. There's probably intermittent stages that I'm leaving out. Bear with me tonight. A proto-science is somewhat random fact-gathering. I call this the sans critical controls. A morass of interesting, trivial, irrelevant observations, and a variety of theories that provide little guidance to data gathering."
Is that where we are?
Well, this is what it feels like, because we can point to people like even Larry Poneman, even the Verizon DBIR to some degree is not a real cohort from a scientific standpoint. It's getting better. We're at the point to say, like for retail breaches that involve law enforcement, what else is there to measure and gather from this incident cohort? But we're not saying this is we can say this is a representative cohort. So this is where it feels like we're kind of sitting. And you can start thinking about this in a number of ways. So how do we get here is the tragedy of two mistakes. First, security as an engineering issue, right? OSI model. We were talking about this today at lunch, right?
Yeah.
Right? So the service-oriented architecture guys have remade this and said, oh, you've got this stuff at the top, right? Which I thought was silly and clever all at the same time. And then they added the deployment layer here, which is cute. My friend Mika, this guy who runs DeepSec, actually removed the top layer and put religion as the top layer. Not religion as in Catholic, LDS, Buddhist, or anything like that, but religion as in here's the dogma that my industry has perpetuated that I'm bringing to the table, right? So PCI DSS is a great example of industry dogma. There's nothing that says any one piece of the DSS actually prevents data breaches, although our intuitive experiences will say it's a good idea to do that for any one piece. But there is nothing that says that's capable. So as we operate in security, I love what he brought to the table, because I think that actually happens. So the first mistake is we think of security a lot down here. And we get clever and we talk about layer 8 sometimes, but mainly on the, oh, that user, they did something stupid again scale, right? We don't think about, well, our organization and risk management scale, nor do we think about what are we actually doing, whether that is NIST cybersecurity framework, ISO, the ISO organizations, and what they put out, and so on and so forth. ISACA. All right. The second is the blind leading the blind. That's our second great mistake, right? So the first piece of this actually I want to cover is the FUD factory. So mobile versus web security, right? Here's the Google trend: web security, mobile malware. Right? Obviously, we've got to be getting better at web security because nobody cares about it anymore, right? And obviously, people are getting owned left and right because mobile malware is a huge deal, if you believe that. Now, I'm creating strawmans left and right. I realize that, but bear with me. This is the DBIR information, and what they've done is they've taken, they've assigned metadata to each kill chain, if you want. So, talk about backgrounding, you talk about a web application attack, and the metadata that they're going to collect around that web application attack is what exact was the techniques involved. Were we talking about cross-site scripting? Were we talking about SQL injection? Right? How did you get to privilege escalation? Did they drop malware down after? What did they do after privilege escalation? Did they drop malware down? Did they use it as a jumping point? Blah, 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 blah. So they create we created all of these, we called them attack models. Then Lockheed Martin sold lots of government contracts by calling it a cyber kill chain, and that just sounds sexier to some people. So what we did was we took all of the incidents, and this is a pattern of across 5,000 incidents, and we created the kill chains. And the visualization here is this, where there's a different, there were several patterns that came out. So point of sale system. Everything with this cover represents a point of sale breach. Now, the size of the dot is an impact. So you're going to have like a Home Depot or something like that versus, you know, a small local grocery store chain. The spread is the disparity in kill chain patterns. So web applications have a very tight cluster because SQLi rules, right? Employee misuse, you've got it all over this area because we've given somebody creds to something, and so there's a lot of diversity in the kill chain. So that's how this visualization works. So back to this. Obviously, web security is not a big deal anymore. Mobile malware, lots of people are getting owned, or is all the rage. Well, here's web only as a function of that. Financial services versus all industry. Web application attacks. 30% of financial institutions breaches, the way that they get owned is through a web application pattern. 6% overall, mainly because error and stupid ransomware and so forth. But it's still a significant piece. Now, part of that metadata is assets. There's your phone asset. Web application, number 2, right? Mobile phone, less than 1%. In fact, the Dutch High-Tech Crime Unit. Okay, I'll pause for a DC 801 only story on the Dutch High-Tech Crime Unit. So I flew in to meet with the Dutch High-Tech Crime Unit. And they're cool guys. They have a space like this, but much cooler. Very Dutch, modern stuff. And I'm walking in with a Verizon contact to structure a deal to get their data into our data set. And the guy looks at me and he goes, okay, you're going to meet the head of the crime unit. He's brilliant. He's fantastic. Roughly translated, his last name means foreskin tree. I spent the next 6 hours trying not to call him foreskin tree. Great guy, and they do an amazing amount of good work. They were baiting a child pornographer to fly into Rome so they could extradite him as I talked, and they had seen his reservations come across, and so they were all excited. Great people. Anyway, the Dutch are like saying, like, look, out of all of this, yeah, there's some, right? But it does not move the needle in our stats as we focus on organizational security incidents as opposed to consumer. So yes, there's a reason the mobile malware spikes probably on a consumer point, but in reality, in terms of how folks get owned, and especially banks, it does not move the needle. And that's a big piece of the FUD factory, right? Now today, I thought it was awesome. Did anybody see the FireEye announcement today of the iOS phone? Sent out a tweet thanking Richard Bietlik for the great work of, Xiaopian and Xingmin Hao and whatever the other two Chinese security researchers who are employed by FireEye for their great work that they did. I'm sure that went over well with Mr. Bietlik. All right. So the other thing is what I call the accounting consultancy industrial complex. So anybody, you guys remember these? Yes. So there's this great story about when CyberTrust got acquired by Verizon. Verizon's this 250,000 employee behemoth, and CyberTrust gets acquired. And they're given these things, right? This was back before the iPhone. And they're told that they have to have 8-character password, uppercase, number, and special character. Strong password policy, right? Who are you to disagree with this? Well, it's also a pain in the butt with fat fingers and tiny phones. So the risk guys sat down with all of their information at CyberTrust, and they put out a really strong analysis that said basically you're much more likely to kill a Verizon employee trying to open their phone while they drive, right, than to actually suffer a data breach with a simple 2-character, just alpha character password, right? Just the likelihoods are just that way. So the question I ask you is, strong passwords kill. Yeah, but do you think that that Verizon said, oh, that so makes sense, we're going to change our policy? Well, absolutely not. It's a best practice to have that strong password on here. And what the organization did, explicitly, but probably, in my opinion, but probably implicitly said, we value passing an audit more than we value the lives of our employees, based on somebody's opinion. So the last thing I'll add to this is, I deal with this all the time in my regular job. The current vogue is for financial services has been SANS critical controls. That's a part of the current vogue. And I've spent part of the last 6 months people going, show us how you deal with all of these elements of the SANS critical controls and identify why you have gaps. Not is it okay if you have a gap on a SANS critical control. And I'm sitting there thinking, I really need to hook these guys up with Dave Shackelford, right, and let him give them a peace of mind about what he thinks about SANS and the critical controls. Basically, these guys get paid by the word. They have a perverse incentive to not take critical controls away. And there's not like there's a UL Labs behind them saying, obviously, this is just, Eric Cole's a brilliant guy, but he sat down, probably had a few beers and said, well, I'm going to make a few $1,000s tonight, and I'm going to write up a critical control on my laptop. And nobody's going to question it because it feels good to say, you really need a strong password on your mobile devices, because my goodness, what would happen if your mobile device ever got compromised? It would be a huge risk. All of that leads to is this. We don't know what we're dealing with. Anybody ever studied complex system stuff? So you may know there's this one lady who worked for SPAF at Purdue who actually did a paper on InfoSec and complex systems. And I came across it, and I was thrilled. I called up SPAF. I'm like, dude, can I talk to her? Can you give me your number? I called her out of the blue. You don't know me, but I read your paper. I'm really excited. What's the litmus test? It's an enterprise network a complex adaptive system. She kind of chuckled lightly, and she said, there's no litmus test. There's no, like, if this happens, then you certainly are. There's just things that help you feel like you might be dealing with a complex system. So anyway, a complex system is a system comprised of interconnected parts, blah, 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 synergistic events. You push on it here, And what comes out of the system over there, you really could not have possibly anticipated in many cases. Sometimes you could have forecast it, but most of your aggregate forecast is going to be wrong. Does that make sense? People deal with this in weather all the time, but they have lots and lots of historical data where we don't. Economics, another complex system. And so people like Frederick Hayek will tell you, like, okay, so if we are looking at an enterprise network or the internet itself, or just the interplay between, on game theory, between malware developer and defender, right, it's going to be very difficult to make point predictions. The risk statements that we make, and essentially, according to him, you just can't do. There's a third blind end, and that's our broken models. We talked about the CVSS a little bit earlier. Anybody read this guy's stuff on CVSS? Fantastic stuff. So years ago, I want to say 2007, 2008, I have a interest in baseball. In baseball, there was this light-hitting shortstop named Mario Mendoza. Great with a glove, great infielder, but could not hit a lick. He struggled every year to hit about 200. In other words, 2 hits for every 10 at-bats. And he played for the Royals one year, and George Brett, who was a very good hitter, right, was talking to some kid and said, look, you better get your average up above the Mendoza line here, or else they're going to send you back down. And the Mendoza line is a phrase, you can Google it, but it's really funny because the implication here is if you can't hit 200, it doesn't matter how good your glove is, you're just not contributing enough to the team. And I said, in many ways, Metasploit is like our Mendoza line. As somebody who has a network to defend, if you can't operate Metasploit, do I really care about you? You might be decent at social engineering or some other attack, but in terms of a technical attack, there's a Mendoza line here that says, can you operate Metasploit? Right? And if so, then I probably care about you. If, and the converse is a little bit true too, from a defender standpoint, if I can't defend against Metasploit, I'm in a really bad position, right? Because then any click and drool kid who can put together Metasploit and the Ruby scripts and so forth inherent in it can, basically cause me to have a bad day. So what Roitman did with Risk.io was he actually tried to see if that was actually true. And so they put a bunch of stuff into their Hadoop cluster. They ran a lot of analysis, and what they came out with was this. You have to have a CVSS score of 9.5 or above to show any difference from random variation. In other words, a CVSS score of 3 on the broader internet is just as likely to get pwned as a CVSS score of 7. Random variance. If you add exploit DB, right, if the vuln is linked to something in exploit DB or Metasploit, right, now you have a statistically significant occurrence. In other words, if it shows up in Metasploit, or better yet, shows up in both Metasploit and exploit DB, guess what? Now you have a more statistical likelihood, actual likelihood, of having a bad day. Unfortunately, most of this stuff, though, is Flash and Java. It's desktop-y oriented stuff. The research doesn't necessarily help me as somebody in charge of enterprise vulnerability management.
I was going to ask, like, if you are somebody who, let's say you're coming in blind, it's a new setup and everything, like the bar, the Metasploit line would be defend against everything that's currently in Metasploit, and if it's in the Metasploit and the exploit DB, hit that first.
That's right.
So that's the bare minimum.
Well, so this is Justin's first week at the bank, right? And I'm thinking about this, and we just had some really crucial conversations with the regulators about our vulnerability reporting.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, I'm dusting off these slides from Vienna, and I'm thinking, this is insane. why are we doing the things that we're doing? Why don't I pay Justin? And we might have to modify your sprint, right? But why am I not paying Justin to go look at this pieces,
Right.
and then let's rejigger a risk rating? We may take exploitability. We may take the metadata that combines to create a CVSS score and use that, right? But it's not. But definitely, to your point, if you're coming in brand new folk, right? Don't just look at the vulnerability score and say, "Well, show me all our high CVSS scores that are outstanding." You want to say, "Show me what we have in an exposure that somebody with probably both of these combinations."
So working backwards through this line, where you're hitting everything that's in the Metasploit and the exploit DB, then protect against things that are outside of that are still in Metasploit, then go look at what's in the exploit DB, move up to CVSS scores. By then you're hitting those high CVSS scores, and that's where you're like, okay,
that's right.
Let's start moving.
So we'll get to this in a few slides, but the weird thing is you don't throw out the CVSS scores just yet. Not completely, because there's a whole other perspective of risk that the industry doesn't take on that has to be addressed. All right, how am I doing time, by the way? Am I boring?
You can go as long as you want.
All right. So this just tries to say, hey, if you're a CSO and you're not getting measured, and you're not investing in measurement, you're being goofy. A lot of us romanticize that as a security officer, right, as somebody defending a network, we're like these cool dudes, right? And the reality is we're going to be more like Toshiro Mifune in his industrial thrillers that Kurosawa directed. The reality is we're going to be much more like this guy. Anybody read Deming at all, ever? Oh, good. So W. Edwards Deming is this brilliant guy, right? And he, after World War II, he figures out what the army and the military was doing right in terms of quality. And he starts talking to people about, well, geez, this is working over here. Why aren't we doing it at the factory floor? So he goes and tries to pitch all of his ideas to U.S. automakers, right? Yeah, and they're like, get out of here, kid, right? We rule the world, you know, we're fine. We just won the war, we're great. So he goes over just kind of on a lark, the story is, and presents to the Japanese, who are just kicking off their industrial revolution. And he shows them his 14 principles, talks to them about this, and all of a sudden, next thing you know, we have Michael Keaton movies, you know, about how the culture clash between Americans, and isn't it, right? And how we're losing all of our auto manufacturing. What he taught them was called management by fact. The Toyota way, Toyota quality management, Kaizen, all this stuff came because he gave a speech in Japan way back when. The stuff that he talks about is basically this. Improvements to the system are never ending. The only people who really know where the real potentials for improvement are the workers. Management, the non-measured CSO, has no idea where the problems are. Does not, will not, right? The only people who will know how things are going down are the line workers. We had a great conversation today about the state of our firewall team. Never bubbled up to me some of the issues that they're dealing with. System is always changing. That's that complex systems thing. Countless ways for the system to go wrong. Another indicator of a complex system. I don't think I have my how complex systems fail stuff in here, but I can give you that. There's a great thing by a doctor who studied hospitals, and he talked about failures in complex systems. And if you take out some of his word failure and you put in security incident, it just jumps right out at you. Metrics used to focus the conversation on fact and improvement. Goals for quality across silo, right? I can't operate with knowing without a great relationship with IT ops. I can't operate without a great relationship with change management. I can't operate without a great relationship with our project management office. We can talk about my relationship with the actual business owner some other day. All right, theories for improvements are implemented and tested. Well, that to some degree we could call a red team, right? Our pen testing. We test every application before it goes live. That is a theory for improvement exercise. And management uses workers as essential instruments in understanding what is. We don't have that I'm aware of. You know, I'm confessing my own failures there when I talk about the conversation we had at lunch today. So describe a measured CSO, right? It's my assertion is relying on metrics for good decisions, but not divorcing the person. Invest in improvements in people, process, and technology. Innovation for improvements in the system. Working tirelessly within the bureaucracy to improve all aspects of the system. And these are actually not my words. These are borrowed from people outside of security too. So let me get to finally the system. The system is that which detects, responds, and prevents. And I'm not putting out prevent, detect, and respond. Bielek, just to pick on him a little more, put out his I believe in the third way blog post. And a lot of us were like, welcome to 2009, Richard. But detect, respond, and prevent is probably more sustainable for most organizations than prevent, detect, and respond. I would argue that you actually have to prevent, detect, respond, and prevent, but that's neither here nor there. So this is what the systems that need to be built are developing metrics from the systems for developing metrics are actually more important than the systems of dogma that define standards of operation. And what I mean by that is this. Developing your metrics, understanding your organization, understanding where you need to make incremental improvements, ultimately is more important than the arbitrary decisions by your auditors, your regulators, the people sitting in an ivory tower creating PCI DSS 3.0 or some HIPAA interpretation for you. It really is. We have this completely backwards, where I would say 80% of the InfoSec shops out there are run by this. Very few of them have been forced to make the investment here.
Question for you.
Yeah.
What kind of metrics do you collect? Because if you look at it from, and I'm coming at this from a red team perspective, you know, security events and detecting it, well, how do you actually use that information to actually say we've detected and stopped 30 attacks, but what about the one that got through? How do you use, what kind of metrics do you actually collect to actually build your InfoSec program?
Very good. At a high level, those that support defend and those that support the planning and building and management of that which defends. But there's slides because you and I think alike on that front. And the slides come from this dude, which is Dr. James or John, and I forget, Snow. He's the father of modern epidemiology. Anybody seen this in Tufte's book? So for those of you who haven't, this is the famous cholera outbreak in London that kind of spawned epidemiology. Basically, the thought at the time was cholera was caused by an ill wind, right? And this guy thinks, I'm not buying this ill wind stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a map. And I'm going to make an X everywhere where there is a water fount, right? A pump, because this is 19th century England, right? And then a dot for every death. And you can kind of see there's a bit of a cluster here, right? This was cancer, we'd say, I want to move out here, right? And sure enough, the X that's right there, that you can hardly see, is this pump that still exists today, right? Because what had happened is they built this pump 3 meters from the decommissioned cesspool. They decommission this cesspool and they say, hey, let's build a pump right over there, right? And then all of a sudden there's a cholera epidemic. People start dying, right? And so epidemiology, you start trying to figure out what determinants there are, right? What are these individual factors? Risk markers, correlation, the correlation is not necessarily causation, comes from that statement comes from statistics applied to epidemiology, right? And basically it gives us the means to find patterns. Remember the DBIR, right, has all these cool patterns in it because this guy, Dr. Peter Tippett, is not just a PhD, he was also a medical doctor, was involved with Peter Norton way back in the day and using terms like virus to describe things and all that stuff. So what he realized is all of a sudden, I got all this failure stuff. I got lots of data on it because I run a pretty good IR team. And I can make friends with the Secret Service and get them on board too. And then we can make an epidemiological look, which is what the DBIR actually is, an epidemiological focused look at information security risk. That's where we built this thing called Verus. And Verus is open as in speech and beer, veruscommunity.net. And it was, I talked about, we didn't call it the kill chain back then, we called it threat models. It was saying, okay, how do we wrap metadata to figure out what exists and what's important around that kill chain? So there is an agent, right, and that's internal, external partner, and you can start defining communities. It's the Eastern Europeans, it's the Chinese APT, whatever labels you want to give. But you have an agent. The agent has an action. Actions are going to be like hacking. These are high-level descriptions, so they have really good definitions used to do it, but they can be confusing at first. But it's hacking, malware, error, misuse, environmental, social, so forth. There's about 8 of them. Assets. Right? That's server, that's mainframe, it's desktop, it's mobile, it's your regular asset inventory. And then attribute. Now there, we went beyond CI&A and used Don Parker's Hexad, which includes like confidentiality and possession, availability, integrity and authenticity, and so forth. So there's actually 6 factors. At a very high level, and this is a tool that I created and open sourced, you can read through all of these. So this is just the top level description of hacking things. So SQL is going to be here, down here somewhere, and I can't even read that, but don't worry about it. You can find this, and it's all on veruscommunity.net, and it's all JSON, which is just awesome. Because once you have it in JSON instruction, you can do some other things that we'll talk about later. So, and these are assets, right? Various other pieces, everything from wiring closet as an asset associated with network infrastructure to people descriptions, janitor, human resources, auditor, cashier, teller, so on and so forth. Because what we had to do was we would get these narratives from the Secret Service or Verizon or the Dutch high-tech premiers, whoever. And it was just like the IR team's description of how the hack went down, right? So as a red team member, how I got to the goal, right? And then we had to make pretty graphs and charts and things out of that. And Verus became this way to create that kill chain, that pattern that says, okay, SQL injection, priv-edge, malware installation, sensitive information capture, exfiltration, that kind of a thing, right? And so this is agent and action, asset and attribute, and the patterns, and where you see a red or a white or a pink square is where there's a combination that shows up in all of the data set. So malware by an external individual dealing in a confidentiality incident via a server 319 times. So these are patterns, right? And what's cool about this is that you can see roughly 90% of this is empty. Not 90% of this doesn't have an ISACA or a COBIT or PCI or whatever mandate. 90% of this just doesn't really occur. The other part of this is at its highest level. The actual matrix scales out to about, we stopped at where it would have been about 6 million squares. But there's enough JSON to cover that. And that's how you get these patterns, is that these, each dot there that we described before, is actually one of those, all the way across. Does that make sense? We're getting there to answering your question. So all of a sudden, to answer your question, you've got data, but you need a framework in which to parse that data, and then you need models to express how you're going to act based on that data. And you're going to have to use set theory to think about it. This is something that I make everybody learn. This is coming your way sometime soon, which is there are really 4 sets of security information that you need to worry about. You can have a great discussion all day from an actor information versus asset information, and it'd be like, hey, these guys are going to be motivated to go after our card readers. You can talk about this is how they're going to do it, and RAM scrapers are going to be a problem. You can even bring in controls and start saying, okay, so what we really need is to run whitelisting software on all of our point of sale systems so that we know when a RAM scraper might be installed, and so that we can block it and so forth. But until you bring in impact, you're not talking about risk. You can talk about impact all day long and say, oh my gosh, everything from multi-target size breaches to people actually dying because of SCADA. But until you start bringing the rest, you haven't discussed risk with somebody yet. There's just a little bit of background. Data warehousing is where you can start doing some interesting stuff. We do a lot with Hadoop and Apache Storm where I live. And so basically you have data from threat, impact, controls, and assets. You go through MapReduce, the whole ETL thing, and you spit it out at some point into reports. More visually, lots of information out in the wild. This might be our firewalls because it's all control information. You might have other information that you collect via ETL, throw it into Hadoop, and parse that stuff out in order to make knowledge where stuff happens in the center. Now, I'm going to skip forward here and say, here's how it matters. If I employed you to do a red team test for me, right, we would say, this is the scenario we want. In the background, my blue team's saying, how can I anticipate the metadata that's collected here to create models, getting confused here, oops, sorry, to create models out so that I can detect and respond, so I can prevent, so that you don't get past here. In other words, what does 3, 4, and 5 look, what does 1 and 2 look like, so I can put in some sort of detective and responsive controls at 3, 4, and 5. Zion, one of the reasons why I relocated, came all the way out here to beautiful Utah to join Zion's is because they are figuring this stuff out faster than most folks. An example of data enrichment around this would be a certification and accreditation process for a system before it goes into production. So you have this entire risk management function, and instead of making up hot, cold, amber, green risk statements and trying to defend those, the real purpose of that should be to collect the good metadata so that you can store that and then enrich the models to detect, respond, and prevent. So you're going to need to understand the who pieces. Like, is there a vendor involved? Is the vendor Sun? Is it Red Hat? Right? Is it an Indian outsourcing group? You're going to need to know who the business unit, the business owner, executive owner, technical owners are, right? Because it's one thing to call up, oh my goodness, we see an event to act on. It's another thing to say, we've seen an event to act on, and I can click on something and spawn an IM window to talk to the technical owner if they happen to be online, right? Whys, business purpose, function, that's more risk stuff out of this, right? The data use cases and types. Transaction amounts for us as a bank versus PII type, data type, right? Because a confidentiality breach versus an integrity breach, essentially, is what you're trying to figure out is the motivation using that metadata. And then application data. What's the URLs? What's the IPs? What's the OS? What languages are written in? What databases it's supported under? What's the virtual infrastructure look like? So on and so forth, right? But as my risk team goes through that, they should be capturing this information and then putting it somewhere so someday we can enrich it and store it. More of this so that we can do more of that based on that. All right. So CVS, that's a very high-level answer. I understand. I'm hoping that more people from our teams like Justin can come and do better conversations about how we do it. But if you're on FSISAC at all, then you'll know Nathan Fowler and you'll know some of our Alabama guys, and that's kind of the output that this creates for us. The information sharing there that happens there. All right. So back to CVSS and why you don't throw everything away. Remember how we talked about a complex system point predictions, it's really hard and so forth? This is cool. So this guy is worked for the Department of Health in the UK, and he created something called a micromort, which is a 1 in a million chance of death. Okay, so for example, you get one micromort by traveling 6 miles via a motorcycle. You get one micromort by traveling 17 miles by walking, 10 miles by bicycle, 230 miles by car, 1,000 miles by jet, 6,000 miles by train, 12,000 miles by jet in the United States, and then suffer it from terrorism, right? So much more likely to die on a motorcycle than you are to die by a terrorist attack in an airplane, right? You can also talk it by events. So if you go hang gliding, there's 8 micromorts per trip every time you hang glide. Drop some X, half a micromort per tablet, right? So we're getting to the point where we can even think about establishing individual micromorts as an industry. We're just getting there, right? We're not there yet. That's that whole Dan Gear stuff that I talked about maybe an hour ago now. Am I prattling on that long?
47 minutes.
47 minutes ago. Thank you. So we might be able to say, well, we might be able to say, okay, well, there's 10 miles by a bicycle. Where it gets even more complicated is, well, what happens if it's 10 miles by bicycle while you're on ecstasy, right? What happens when it's 10 miles on bicycle and you're not really in shape to go on the bicycle? What happens when it's 10 miles on bicycle, but you're on a rocket bicycle riding on that, right? What the measured CISO has to do is understand where an overweight ecstasy smoking and the enemy smoking, while riding a rocket power bicycle on the railing of the bridge, right? Because IT matters. The CVSS scores, the medium scores, the lower scores you can't throw out because they're indicative of health problems that don't necessarily aggregate up, right? That low CVSS score might just be, I've had too many cheeseburgers as an organization. That higher CVSS score might be, okay, well, actually, we're on a bicycle on a railing. But it's very difficult to say where you're all of the above. And this guy who's cool, I don't know if anybody knows Jim Kim or not, he did this a long time ago. And it basically said, yeah, you have to operate at the whole level, right? You have to worry about IT. The weird thing that came out of Visible Ops of Security, if you ever look at the data, is the two most the leaders who are most effective CISOs in terms of incidents have 2 backgrounds in general: military, auditor. And it's not necessarily because they understand the threat environment or they're really good at security measurement or any of that stuff. It's because they run really strict processes that reduce variance in their environment. In other words, the processes happen so that this kind of stuff isn't very common. Taking care of the fact that they don't know about that. So I'll leave you with something that you can take home. I asked who had exposure with GQM. One of the reasons why we're just not here as an industry is because we have measurement is really bad. It's really hard to do. Most folks will say measurement's something for security is something I expect the line manager to do. I want firewall metrics. Well, somebody's going to have to tack on to their 40-hour-a-week job another 5 hours to develop metrics. Not should there be a data scientist somewhere in the CISO structure that then looks at what's going on and talks to them about it. Most metrics programs look at something a little bit like this, because we're just gathering information, throwing it together, and then trying to make sense of it. Here's a collection of numbers. Hope that's cool for you. Funny slide. All right. If you consider a metric as a single building block, the problem becomes this. It's got to be used by the CSO to paint a picture of the whole security program. So that one perhaps meaningful metric, if you think of complex systems, if you think of that sort of stuff, that's one block. It's a crucial block, but it's one block of an overall picture. We are terrible at giving this picture. That would be enough that we're terrible at giving this picture, but the reality is the business is seeing this picture, right? The business is seeing a much larger picture where they're balancing risk versus reward. Most businesses aren't going off and doing security stupid things just to piss us off. Most of the time they're trying to feed us, right? So the context is all of IT. The problem is, without context, without understanding those circles that I showed, without doing good kill chain work, this is what your metrics programs looks like. It's kind of like our basement, right, Wayne? Right? We've got a red brick somewhere in there. There's your metrics. Go figure out if it's got meaning or not. And that's where this dude comes in. He is measurement badass Victor Basili. And he created this for software development, but it works really well for us. It's called goal question metric. It's a little method. It is also free as in speech, free as in beer. Look it up on Wikipedia and download free white papers and all sorts of stuff. But basically, you have this goal. All right? And so you ask yourself questions about how do I know if I'm meeting or not meeting this goal? Then you look for metrics that say, can I support a yes or no answer to these questions? Goal, multiple questions, multiple metrics. Does that make sense so far? Right? So this also is, if you want to execute, figure out what the models, these questions represent models or hypotheses that you're going to say. Well, a strong vulnerability management program will be one that has no external facing systems with vulnerabilities that have corresponding exploits in exploit DB or Metasploit, right? Or do I have, how many systems do I have with that? Am I looking at exploit DB and do I have a good refresh rate on those things? Yes or no, right? What is my refresh rate? Measuring that's going to be important, right? And you can keep asking if do I have a good having a great vulnerability management program is goal number one. There's all of those questions. How often am I scanning? How do I know if I'm scanning enough? Right? There's metrics that you can build out there. One example here, I use a mind mapping tool for this. One example here is patch management. Is it comprehensive? Is it timely? Is it cost efficient? In other words, well, I got to patch the width of my organization and the depth of my organization. I got to do it in a time-sensitive manner many times. And I have to spend the right amount of money on a patch management system for me. So is it comprehensive? So now you can talk about, well, am I covering my business units well? Am I covering my asset categories well? You know, and then you're looking at Unix, Windows servers, desktop, you know, and so forth. Both their OS and their components. You can bust out applications as well. Am I covering the right thing? Am I comprehensive by the right things, right? If I've got a decent risk register already, I can bust out by likelihoods. right? What do my threat models say I have to worry about? Am I patching what my threat models say I have to worry about? How many people are linking what their threat models say they worry about versus a patching metric, right? That specificity, very, very few. But it makes sense when you think of it logically that way. Coverage by impact, right? Am I patching the stuff that has the sensitive information on it, right? Or not? Coverage by risk. What are my most significant patch failures? Right? So system fragility is a risk point. Do I know, how long does it take me to patch that one system that always drops because the application patches from the vendor suck? Timeliness. What should our priorities be for timeliness? What is our time? What is the timeliness for patching by likelihoods? What is timeliness for patching by impacts? By those populations, what percentage are late by both of those? What are our repeat offenders looking like? What our other considerations for timeliness might be? Cost efficient, cost per hour spent patching. Cost per hour spent patching by asset category, because it might be more cost expensive for you to support your desktops than your Unix servers. Does that make sense? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I'm not here to judge, I'm here to give you information, right? Cost per asset spent patching by location. How expensive is it for us to patch in our DMZ? That's a cost worth taking, but if it's our internal network, then it costs us a lot in terms of, and that cost can be just man hours, can be downtime, a number of things. Cost by risk reduction. Hour by asset by annualized loss expectancy found in the risk register per hour. Funny metric. So what you really need, right, is to be measured, to really take a look at your entire system, right, because you can only address the system. Addressing the individual, well, did I drop ecstasy or not, and do I just have 0.5 micromorts, or while I dropped ecstasy, did I also do a bunch of other dumb stuff, and the real micromorts were 30 or whatever. You have to understand that. You also, if you believe Chill and Frederick Hayek here, you also are now measuring the individual parts of the complex system to get better knowledge of it versus trying to make these ridiculous forecast predictions that are going to be completely inaccurate, which is what most risk registers are built to do. But you're going to want to add, make sure you start gathering historical values. We like the Hadoop. Establishing triggers and thresholds. This is tricky. Most of it's going to be, feels like if it got less than this or more than that, it's going to be bad kind of thing. That's okay, right? What you're really doing is you're really starting to manage to variance in your environment. And it's a fairly scientific notion if you want to think of it that way, right? They're not going to be perfect, but they establish hypothesis for testing and optimization as they've done there. My team did a GQM for all of NIST CSF. It's a horrible thing. It's freely available, free as in speech as in beer. It's on the Society of Information Risk Analysts website. But it's really cool. And you can go download that and use it. And they're kind of just GQM guesses. Went through a GQM exercise for all of the areas of the NIST CSF and said, well, if I was interested in ID-3 or whatever the subcategory is, here's what I would go look at. Right? And so you can just download that, take a look at our stuff, tell us we're goofy and that there are better metrics, or use our metrics, doesn't matter. That's an open source project, not associated with where I work. All right, so, and that's kind of, here's a couple of things to leave you with for goal question metric and the micromorts things. Wikipedia is a great place to look at them. Go to Verizon for the DBIR data and more stuff there. Deming quotes the works of Myron Tribus, who's this awesome Bayesian who is hardcore, he's still alive, hardcore physics, business at MIT, and engineering background. Just a brilliant, brilliant guy. And so there are some links there. his thoughts on stuff in Derek. Thanks.
Thank you, Bravo. Bravo.
So, the question on that, to kind of follow up, is you're taking metrics you're collecting to build these patterns, build this information to say, here's what we can expect or what we think we expect to see. Here's how we build our risk management, our security programs to cover, the 80 to 90% baseline. And it's these other 10% that you actually have to have that hands-on, humanized, to really determine, okay, we have a risk here that can't be covered by our statistical analysis is below it.
Wow, that's really good. It takes a lot of people a lot of time to usually get to that point. Let me pull this up real quick, because there's a slide that'll expand on this real well. So you remember this slide from the DBIR, financial services patterns and industry patterns? I think this aligns, what I'm about to say kind of aligns with what you're saying. So assuming that I can trust the size of the DBIR sample, and I forget exactly how many this represents. I want to say it's 120 over the past 2 years internationally. That's a pretty good sample size of breaches, right? What this means is this, and this, definite pattern, definite incident of occurrence, definite likelihoods, definitely statistically significant. If I'm not managing to these, I'm a fool. These, it's not clear, and this is where this is not a cohort, it's not a great study, but the implication would be these are random. Now, I'm just bear with me. If we trusted the uncertainty in these numbers, it would not necessarily mean so much that insider misuse is a greater likelihood than miscellaneous errors, so I should spend 2% more of my budget over here kind of thing. What it means is, compared to this, the variance isn't statistically significant. It's relatively random. This is how attackers own me. This other stuff happens, but its occurrence of incidents is going to be so random that I can't really manage to it like I can manage to these. So if I want to optimize my modeling in that detect, respond, and prevent model, I'm going to optimize it there. I may do some here, right? Especially around errors and configuration management, because some of those will lead to these. But in general, I'm not going to manage to this.
Okay.
Or at least my budget won't reflect a heavy investment to manage to this.
Okay, so then to take that a step further, you're hedging your bets that you're going to cover that 80%, 90%, and then you're going to be able to, with what technologies you have in place and through that variance, be able to detect anything that falls outside of that.
Hedging your bets is an interesting way to put it. If I can rephrase it, it would be realizing that my budget is finite.
Okay.
How do I allocate that? Right? That doesn't mean that I just say, no, I'm not going to spend any money on lost laptops. And in fact, that's one of the downsides of using this data this way, is saying lost laptops don't occur because it's not a good control. Lost laptops occur because it's a well-adopted control. Versus we just are really bad at putting good web apps out there, right? So you can't just use it like that. And so the hedging your bets is, I wouldn't say that is an accurate characterization of the strategy. But what it does say to me is, okay, if you're I'm not necessarily gonna worry about insider misuse as much as I'm gonna worry about security in the SDLC.
Okay.
At this point, with this quality of data.
It's like a resource alignment issue, essentially.
Yeah, and hedging your bets, I would agree with that, but a lot of people would say, ooh, that's a terrible way of phrasing it.
Okay. I get this question all the time from my customers, my clients is, okay, we're covering, we're building secure apps. We're now building that. We're doing good controls here. We've got good controls here. Yet you guys come in, walk in, and within 2 days, you've completely compromised our environment. You have compromised everything we have, all of our data. Yet how could we have prevented, caught, detected, and kept you guys from getting to that?
Yeah.
And I tell them, well, you need to do these different things. And it's like, well, how does that fit into our security lifecycle?
So I don't know the typical scope that you create in a red team, right? Phishing, social engineering phishing, that's hard. It's hard to stop. It's like shells everywhere,
Okay.
from the main, right? I mean,
There's that. You've got the insider threat or even an external threat walking in and physical access, dropping in a Dropbox on a network, walking out that's got a cellular card on it that calls home. It's now got somewhat of a network access that's just passively listening on the wire.
yeah. So you got a couple of situations where you may be very successful, but what the data is saying is not unlike the mobile malware slides.
Mhm.
It happens, it just doesn't happen that much,
Okay.
right? So this is I'm sorry, I should insider misuse, right?
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is understanding what an insider misuse means, right? And what you're going to do. If you give me credentials as an internal pen tester, why spend the money, right? You've given me the credentials. These people sometimes already have the credentials,
Well,
almost all the time.
a couple of engagements I've recently done has been an insider threat. What could a typical, college student coming in, first job, they're on the phones, do with their credentials? A basic access, right?
Screw credentials.
Yeah, forget
And
credentials.
could they go from point A to point Z and compromise the entire security of the organization
Yes.
from that? So, and we
The
get asked,
answer is always yes.
well, of course it is, but what I'm saying is I get asked, how could we have detected, prevented that, or what could we have done in our security life cycle that can actually let us get to that point?
And that's what's so hard, right? Because then you're talking about an organization that makes significant investments in this crap. Whoops. Right? Just getting started to be able to think about that. The trick is that 6 million different squares, right? Which of those squares, you can only worry about so many squares. You're never going to worry about you're never going to be able to worry about all 6 million. Not in this lifetime, right? And so are the squares we choose and the squares that we want to worry about. And to ask about what you can do to defend, well, then you got to figure out that security strategy that does that, right? So maybe you can't stop the box from getting on the network, right? Maybe you can't stop somebody from having escalated privilege, right, in a timely manner. But can you bubble up, can you identify the asset that they're really wanting to go after? And that gets hard in a bank because every asset has got value inside the crunchy perimeter. But can you identify that asset that has value? And can you make something here that detects the factors that would light up there so that you go there? It's a little more than just SIM, right? SIM's not the solution. It's a little more than SIM in that you've got to wrap a handful of metadata. You have to describe to whatever the SIM-like thing that is bubbling up to you what the event looks like, right? You can't just do rote correlation and say, interesting logging event here. No, you need an interesting logging event with some sort of net flow capture that shows also some other attempt and blah, 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 blah.
Okay.
That's near impossible. So it's very difficult, put it that way. And there aren't a lot of people doing it. And the other problem, and Anton Chavakin's a pretty good guy. He runs this space for Gartner, and he and I talk every so often. And one of the problems that we're seeing is there are people starting to try to help you do this stuff. The problem is, out of that, all of those squares, they're picking a couple squares, right? And they're saying, give us $250,000 a year, and we got these squares covered in this way. The reality is there were more than a couple squares that were bright red. So the reality is that's not a sustainable process. Some people don't have who have to worry about this threat, don't have $250,000 to spend on that, on those 2 squares, more or less 6 or 7 or 12 squares. My organization couldn't sustain a business model where we had to pay $250,000 a year for every square. We just couldn't, right? So that's why you're starting to see a lot of folks start to go, okay, well, if we're going to build out this thing, right, we actually need to start getting those product managers in Silicon Valley figure out what we need from their equipment in order to make this happen, because we're just not getting it from them anymore, right? It's because we're going to have to build it ourselves. They can't build it. We're not going to pay $20 million to cover our squares, nor are we going to invest in you to build this piece for us, right? You may support this, but that's not we're not going to, I always laughed when Archer, when the RSA, like 2 years ago, I think it was, like, Archer's your big data analytics platform. I'm like, are you insane? What data scientist is like, you know what I could really use? Archer. So the security companies also have to realize that they're not going to make $1 bajillion by being this for everybody too. That their real value is making this easy. If I could just get frickin' Rapid7 to not break that feed every frickin' update, I'd be a happy man. Because every frickin' update, my ETL job falls apart. So,
Thanks, brother.
thank you for having me. It's good space.